I've had some further thoughts on the topic of masochism, so I thought I would call this talk Masochism Part 2. Um, First of all, my previous talk was based on the paper by Bernhard Berliner. For some reason, I kept calling him Berliner, but I think obviously the correct pronunciation of his name is Berliner. Um, and the paper was called An Object Relations Understanding of Masochism. Um, and he makes it very clear that, he's concerned not with sexual masochism, but with what Freud called moral masochism, or what we could call psychic masochism. Moral masochism is a good term because the moralistic superego is centrally involved in moral masochism. It moralizes, it reproaches, quite distinct from conscience, as I've argued, and I won't elaborate on all of that today. Moral masochism, a struggle with a critical superego, a sense of guilt, unconscious guilt leading to an unconscious need for punishment. People who suffer from moral masochism, I believe it was in his paper called Some Character Types Met With in the Course of Psychoanalytic Work, that Freud describes those who fear success, those who are wrecked by success, and the criminal from a sense of guilt. Those who are wrecked by success unconsciously equate success with some kind of crime, with some kind of triumph. I recall when I received my PhD degree and my father took me to a special dinner, and I squirmed throughout the meal because in my neurotic mind, my becoming Dr. Carveth was planting a dagger between his shoulder blades. He was proud as punch. He was very happy. But in my mind, it was an Oedipal crime. There were now two Dr. Carveths. I was in the process of bumping him off the log. That was my fantasy. And certainly that had led to a fear of success. I procrastinated for a long time trying to write that PhD dissertation. Procrastination is a type of moral masochism. People torture themselves through procrastination. The university student who knows that she has to write this paper, her friends are going out to the movies and they want her to go, so she goes, but she doesn't enjoy the movie. She's squirming throughout, thinking she should be home writing that paper. And then she has to humiliate herself further by going to the professor to ask for an extension. This is all self-punishment, rooted in some imagined crime or sin or wrongdoing. Procrastination, a form of self-torture. So that's the fear of success. And then there are those who actually allow themselves to go and have the success and pay the price afterwards. He defends his doctoral dissertation, and on the way home from the university, he manages to get hit by a car. Or he goes out to celebrate with his partner, and he presses all of her buttons, and they have a big, ugly squabble, and the evening is ruined, and he punishes himself that way. Many PhD students, after they finally achieve the degree, they fall into what I think of as a post-PhD depression. We all know about the postpartum depression that many women suffer after giving birth to a child. What kind of crime was that against mother or father or whoever to actually produce this child? And now they fall into a big depression, which is a form of self-attack. Similarly, after the PhD, the post-PhD depression. These are people who are wrecked by success because unconsciously the success is understood as some wrongdoing that must be punished in some way. Uh, Freud points out that some people punish themselves prior to the crime. That's the procrastination. When you've suffered enough, you can finally let yourself have the success. Some people punish themselves after the crime, the post-PhD depression. The sexual masochist has a certain kind of economy in all of this, because instead of suffering before the crime or after the crime, he suffers simultaneously with the crime. The success in this instance is the orgasm, and he has to be humiliated, perhaps burned with a cigarette, slapped, insulted, humiliated, whatever, at the very time or just preliminary to the orgasm. So he suffers simultaneously instead of before or after. So we're talking about people who defeat themselves in one way or another. The critical accusing superego is at work in all of this. Freud saw all of this as the turning of the aggressive drive back around against the self. Berliner's contribution is to suggest that in many of these cases, the drive is not really at the root of the problem. It's early traumatic experience with a withholding or sadistic or cruel or critical object. Okay, I elaborated all of that in the previous video. I had a very interesting and illuminating conversation with a very wise friend of mine, and she cast doubt on Berliner's point that when the child who seeks love finds non-love, finds cruelty, rejection, Berliner talks about how the child comes to deny the sadism or the cruelty and actually comes to regard the cruelty or the rejection as love, denies the sadism involved, and comes to actually mistake non-love for love. And I was troubled by that point in reading Berliner, and my friend brought me back to that. She greatly doubts the validity of that point. She thinks it's not that the child confuses non-love for love. She thinks that, in fact, the object from time to time gives a little bit of love, crumbs, and the child gets addicted to getting the crumbs. So he placates and he begs and he beseeches and he puts up with ill treatment, all in the hope of getting one or more of those crumbs. This is intermittent reinforcement, which, as we know from studies with rats and other animals, is a very powerful form of reinforcement, intermittent reinforcement. I think this is a better way of understanding the addiction to getting blood from the stone. Every once in a while, the stone gives a little bit of blood, and that really forms the addiction. So I don't think it's so much that the child confuses non-love for love. He's just addicted to getting a little bit of love every once in a while, and that keeps him clinging to the rejecting or the cruel object. Okay. Those are a couple of additions I wanted to make to the previous video. There's a lot more that can be said about moral masochism. I indicated that whereas Berliner exempted the obsessional neurosis, thinking that that really does evolve less from object relations than from the intensity, perhaps constitutionally based intensity of the aggressive drive that gets turned on the self. I doubt that. I suspect that in the obsessional neurosis, as in depression, as in masochism, the sadism of the superego is most likely internalized from experience with early objects that were, to a greater or lesser degree, sadistic, cruel, withholding, abandoning, etc. So even in the obsessional neurosis, I think we're dealing with a superego that represents internalized sadism rather than the sadism of the drive. Okay.